We fight for the bread that makes life possible and the roses that make it beautiful. We fight for what we need, both to live and to thrive. And it has been another week of fighting in exhausting and peculiar and occasionally inspirational ways this week in this nation of ours. Partisanship that carves the entire concept of truth into camps of red and blue. Floodwaters claiming Venice with the rising threat of climate change. Yet another shooting in yet another school. Passing by so quickly it seems we barely notice now, though 2 more people are dead. 5 hours of testimony from a U.S. diplomat who was committed to speaking her truth, knowing the backlash would be strong and unpredictable. Did you see her keep on speaking anyway? All while the NRA just up the road in Fairfax goes on spending God knows how much money lobbying Congress to ensure that the status quo survives, no matter who did or did not have a quid pro quo with any foreign government. Another week of hearts broken and hearts numbed. Another week of senseless violence to we know not what end. Another week of fires burning, of young people rising up, of generational discord, of danger to those with marginalized identities. Another week of infighting around every corner. We have all been living it. So perhaps I do not need to describe it in greater detail, and perhaps it feels like you have been living some version of this week's events over and over again. It has been, on many levels, an exhausting and yet altogether normal week for this interconnected organism that is the United States of America. And the truth is that more than a few of us are tired of fighting both for the bread that keeps us alive and the roses that make life worth living. A few of us are tired of resisting, are tired of pushing back at the systems all around us and worrying that we might not be pushing back hard enough. Tired of resisting and resistant to slowing down. Tired of wondering what form of resistance it is that will ultimately turn the tides or move the mountains, or break through the hard-hearted rock of hate. These last years have felt something like a litany of resistance, not just in this place, but in so many of our lives, collectively, personally, spiritually, fighting for what you believe in, for your livelihood, for your worth, for your life, for your people, for yourself, for your well-being. And what we ask today is this question: what is the state of resistance individually and collectively in 2019? In Star Wars, the Rebel Alliance, you know, it always seems to be in tatters. The rebels always seem to be hiding out on the dark side of some tiny moon somewhere, and you always wonder if the resistance will survive. And so how is the Rebel Alliance holding up just now? How can we stay in the game? Because opting out of the resistance is a privilege that neither our nation nor the planet itself can offer, no matter how much we would rather hide out on the dark side of any given moon but ours. This morning, I woke up to news that in Prince William County, where I used to live, the political winds have turned such that local cooperation with federal immigration and customs enforcement officials is being pulled back. Now, in my own life story, I can tell you that 10 years ago, I woke up every day with a fierce and burning anger at the fact that the local authorities where I lived were pulling over people with brown faces merely for the fact that they were driving while brown, and I screamed and protested and picketed that local cooperation with ICE. I screamed until I could scream no more, and I woke up this morning, 10 years later, to the news that indeed that fight that I had fought with my whole soul has been won by political muscle built over time by people who consistently, persistently, and slowly fought so that they might not be exhausted, so that they might replenish their will to resist another day. And perhaps that, more than anything else, is the state of the resistance in 2019. Be it personal, collective, political, the state of resistance in these our days is strong, but more than a little weary and very much in need of the kind of persistence that can sustain us long after the red-faced screaming and yelling, the picket lines and the protest are done, that can sustain us not just for a few days of a good fight, but for years and years of steady and sustained effort. The great Howard Thurman once wrote that anyone who wants to make change in themselves or in the world, that anyone who wants to make change must look first of all for the growing edge out past every strategy you have ever used before. The only way for the resistors to be transformed and sustained so that they can transform the world is for the resistance itself to try something new from time to time. As he put it, the growing edge of resistance is the extra breath from the exhausted lung. It is the one more thing to try when all else has failed. The upward reach of life when weariness closes in upon all endeavor. These days, it seems even more important to look for the growing edge of that which we have not fully tried when it feels like all the well-practiced forms of resistance have indeed been practiced already. In this room, you have held signs, and you have marched the marches, and you have proclaimed such truths as you have known to speak, and you will do all of that again, as will we all. There will be another fight where I scream red-faced and angry at the injustice of this world and the winds that blow beyond my power to control. Oh, there will be a fight, and we will get in it. But what if the growing edge of resistance in my life, in our life together, what if the lifeblood of the rebel forces itself sometimes looks a little less like a street fight and sometimes looks a little more like a leaning persistently toward everything we yearn for, a persistent reaching for the sources of life that keep us in the mix just as long as it takes to break that rock or move that mountain? I went back this week and actually read all of the sermons I have preached on resistance over the course of the last 6 years. I guess I wanted to know what the heck it is I have been saying all this time, so that I might wonder if there was something new I could say today. And guess what? Through it all, I just am recycling one metaphor that I pulled out of a sermon 6 years ago. So maybe the message isn't totally useless in the midst of all the strategy and all the empowerment and all the fighting and the response. There's one metaphor I found from a sermon I preached in 2013, right after the Boston Marathon bombing. Do you remember that day? Do you remember what it felt to wake up in our country that day and that week? I learned about this metaphor that week that gave me hope that still matters today. It's about trees. It was discovered by botanists and tree researchers who studied what trees do under stress, what happens. There's this adaptation, you see. It's called reaction wood, or sometimes tension wood. It is shaped within the life of a tree only when in active resistance to outside forces that bear upon that tree. Biologically, this thing, it's a lengthening of the cellular structure. It's like the stretching of a muscle. It is a kind of muscular development that responds to the environment by pulling and pulling and pulling that tree back toward the light for which it yearns, no matter what the outside environment does to it. Woodworkers will tell you that reaction wood is the worst. It is the hardest to shape into a tree or a chair, into a stool or a table or a chair. It is the hardest to cut and to polish and to manipulate. It is perfect, however, for forming the shafts of arrows and the handles of axes, the implements of change that require unyielding strength, because it is born naturally by the tree's desire to reach endlessly toward the light for which it yearns, no matter what impediments block its way, and in reaching consistently, persistently toward that light for which it yearns, the cellular structure of that tree becomes stronger. You know, of course, that the whole life story of a tree is contained within its rings. The oak never loses the mark from droughts that spark the Dust Bowl. The poplar always bears the scar of the pruning hook. And even 50 years later, if you look closely, you can watch the evidence of each new external pressure, of each new resistance etched in the rings of the branch of every tree. As naturalist David Quammen has put it, the shape of a given tree represents its whole interaction with nature and experience. Give it time, and a tree will pull and pull until the wire you tried to choke it with is broken. Give it time. And if you press downward on a single branch in a single place, it will inch by inch, moment by moment, climb in zigzag fashion right back up toward the sun. So it is with us. So it is with our resistance. The shape, the scope, the particular arrangement of our being represents our steady yearning toward the light, even as the world bears in on us. The rings of our being show the marks of what we have seen, of what we have known, and the growing edge of our response to a sometimes dangerous environment. The stronger, longer fibers formed in the midst of tension are designed to steadily pull us back toward the light beyond all the violence and pressure of our environment. It's like a rubber band developed to pull and pull and pull until what was almost broken is turned back toward the right. For a tree, this steady and unyielding resistance arises from the natural law that the trees yearn for the light. And so the growing edge is not a fight for survival so much as an unceasing yearning. What makes yearning itself a form of resistance is that persistent reach, always, for what we really need, for love, for integrity, for the soul food of community and connection. Such is the growing edge, said Thurman. It is the extra breath in the exhausted lung. It is the one more thing to try when all else has failed. It is the upward reach of life when weariness threatens to close in upon all your endeavors. Such is the growing edge, the upward reach of life. Be like water, Kendra Ford wrote in our meditation today. Eat boulders quietly. Make a way out of no way. Move mountains one particle at a time. Trickle through the tiniest path to the sea until the heart of stone that stands in your way breaks wide open. Resist not just or mostly by throwing the rock, but by cracking it. Resist not by breaking the chains, but by growing so strong that the chains cannot contain you. So often in our culture, we speak of resistance, especially to oppressive forces, as if it is an introvert's game. As if it is merely the domain of the loud and the fearless and those willing to sacrifice it all. We speak of the ones who fight back relentlessly, as if they have some sort of magical power of resistance that the rest of us do not. But what if all that resistance is really just another expression of the same yearning, a yearning for light, for life, for wholeness that every single one of us has and every single one of us can access, whether we want to stand in the midst of the fire or not. Even and especially the loudest and proudest activists among us need to resist in different ways sometimes. Just as we all yearn, we all have limits. A window of tolerance outside of which it becomes impossible to hold all the tension. Our bodies can hold stress up to a point, but beyond that point, things start to get untenable. The whole resistance is at risk of falling apart, which means sometimes finding the growing edge of our own resistance means finding out the right time and the right place to slow the heck down. As my colleague Molly Hausch-Gordon has written, if we want to stay in the struggle in a way that is both engaged and healthy, if we want to learn to hold our own tension, we need to find a way to keep our nervous system online. The ask then is not for people to spend all their time outside of their comfort zone, because outside of that comfort zone is where we get overwhelmed. The ask is to make the comfort zone bigger by stretching it like we would a tired or tender muscle. Stretch it like the fibers of a tree under tension. Stretch it toward the light for which you yearn. Stretch the forms of resistance you have known toward the forms of resistance you have not yet tried. The truth is that no one can really affect the change we need in the world without busting the boundaries, without being fearless, without the activists among us who will shout and who will scream. Power concedes nothing without demand. And yet, it is also true that not all those who would resist are capable of tearing it all down. Not all those who would seek after the growing edge of our country are going to do it by manning the barricades and hoisting the banners. Some of us, resistors through and through, will stay put like the trees, bearing the evidence of the harm all around us and reaching with every newly strengthened fiber of our being toward that light which still shines, which still calls. Some of us, like water, trickle down into the bedrock and change the systems that every single thing is built upon. Some of us sit at desks and quietly refuse to do what we are told. Some of us put on a nice clean suit and stand in a courtroom to argue for something we believe in. Some of us carry cups of hot chocolate to press into the cold hands of the protesters on the picket lines, and some of us simply reach out beyond what we have known to the growing edge of our own relationships, putting ourselves in the path of love so that we can be called to care for those whom we have not cared for fully before. We are all pulled by the yearning that gives us life, a yearning for connection, for knowing and being known, a yearning for stability, a yearning for love. Cut a cross-section of any mighty oak and you can see a history of its wounds, etched right there in the rings of its growth. You can read the signs of drought, you can see the mark of the axe, but look closer, look down deeper to its essence, and you can also see the evidence of its unyielding resistance, the mighty silent strength that lasts 100 years and more, the indomitable fibers reaching ever upward toward the sun. So let us fight some days, and let us grow, and let us reach always, unceasingly, as we resist and thrive in the fascinating, exhausting, perilous times in which we live.